Hey guys, welcome back to Snake Limited. I am John, and today I want to talk about whether or not it is safe to feed live prey, live mice, live rats to your snakes. And this is going to focus really solely on ball pythons. Most people that have other breeds of snakes usually don't have an issue feeding frozen thawed if they choose to go that route. I have a pair of rainbow boas, a boa constrictor, a few rat snakes, a garter snake. I'm trying to think. I think that's it. And they all take frozen thawed, no issues. But out of my ball pythons, let's say I have, under 100, but somewhere in 60, 70 range. I would say that more than half of them will only take live prey. So I made a post a couple weeks back, and it was actually just about baby rats. But somebody started having a conversation about whether or not it was safe to feed live prey. So I'm going to go through that in this video. All I have to say about this, in the opening section here, is that if you have one or two snakes, three snakes, even if you've had them for a few years, that's not a lot of experience compared to breeders that can have hundreds of snakes or thousands of snakes and have been doing this for years. They should really be the source for information for a lot of this stuff because they've been there, they've been doing it, and having hundreds or thousands of snakes gives you a lot of experience in a small amount of time. Personally, if I own 60 snakes and I've had them for 4 or 5 years, that gives me a lot more experience than somebody who's had 3 snakes for 20 years. Because I'm doing that every single day. I have 60 different snakes with 60 different personalities, and that requires 60 different ways of handling them, and they're all a little bit different. So that gives me a ton of experience. So, if somebody wants to get into a comment war in the comments below a post for anybody, not just me, pay attention to who they are and whether or not they really have any experience doing what they're doing. Because I don't want you to really just take to heart what they're saying and think, oh, you know what, they're making a good point. They might be making a good point, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way to kind of think about a topic. So I'm going to go through in this video whether or not it is safe to feed live prey to your ball pythons, and really any snakes, but we're going to focus on ball pythons because they're really the pickiest snakes that I've had any experience with. So let's dive into it. Now, I'm not going to bury the answer to this question in case you don't want to watch this whole video, but I'm going to explain why this is my answer. And my answer is, yes, it is actually safe to feed your snakes live. And, snakes aren't being fed frozen thawed animals in the wild. They're catching live prey. And every once in a while, does a snake get an injury from something that it's trying to eat? Absolutely. Every once in a while, does a snake die from getting an injury from something they're trying to eat? Absolutely. Now, we're obviously trying to prevent those sorts of things here, when you have a pet snake, but you can't get away from having to feed live. Now, I have several other snake species other than ball pythons, and all of them take frozen thawed. I prefer to feed frozen thawed because of the injury factor. It does occur. It's also easier to keep things frozen in a freezer than to have to constantly keep a supply of feeders. These are all rats, and those two things have mice over there. It's a lot easier to keep a freezer full of frozen rodents than it is to have to breed and take care of a bunch of rats. But I'm at the point in my business where I have so many ball pythons that it's impossible to keep them all in frozen thawed. Now, the hatchlings, I try to get these guys on frozen thawed as soon as possible. Sometimes they don't like them. Some of these hatchlings here, they're still taking live mice. They don't want frozen yet. But usually after 3 or 4 meals, I can get them over to frozen thawed. I have a couple from the Urban Camo project here. Anything that was lightning pied from earlier in the year, they're actually all in frozen thawed at this point. Hatchlings can be a little more difficult to switch over to frozen thawed. Now, I switched them to frozen thawed because I prefer frozen thawed, and because for most people, if they're buying a snake for me as a pet, they just want to feed frozen thawed. A lot of people don't have access to live rodents, especially at all the different sizes that snakes require. Let's see. Now, some of the older snakes that I have, let's say this one, I picked this pied female up. She was already probably 1,000 grams when I got her. She refuses to take frozen thawed for me. Everything I've tried for her, she has refused to eat. Now, this female here, I actually raised her up from a hatchling, and she takes frozen thawed because I started her off on frozen thawed. I haven't had any issues keeping her on frozen thawed. But the fact of the matter is, when you have a ball python and you have several ball pythons, there's a good chance that a lot of them are just going to refuse frozen thawed, especially if they weren't fed frozen thawed from the beginning. If they're started off on live and you bought this snake when it's a year old, 2 years old, the chances are that you're not switching it over to live, or to frozen thawed, sorry, it's gonna stay on live. But there are a couple ways to kind of keep your snake safe when you are trying to feed it live. One of the ways is try to feed it something a little smaller. These little guys here, typically, I guess you would probably call them smalls. I like to keep the moms in there a little longer, probably than most people do. But as you can see, these guys here are they fit in the size of my hand. They fit in my hand pretty easily, but they're all scared, so they don't want to come out. Let me get this down here. See if I can get in there a little better. There. So these are, I guess, what most people would consider around smalls. Now, a big female ball python, this isn't going to be a huge meal for her. However, if you decide to feed something this size, the chances of this rat injuring the female are a lot less likely. It's probably a lot safer to feed this to your adults than something a little bigger, like an adult rat. This one right here, this is a mommy rat, and these are her little babies that I still have in here with her. And if you look at her, if I can get this down here, she's right there in the middle. If you look at the size of her compared to the other ones, she is probably 3 times the size. Now, the issue with feeding something this big, the mommy rat, to a larger ball python, is that their teeth are humongous, and they do pack a wallop when you are feeding these guys, the mommies here, mommies and daddies, to your ball pythons. Now, the way that I kind of, let me adjust this here, the way that I kind of protect my snakes, if I have a bigger ball python that only takes live, is by, let's see here, now Princess here, she only takes live. I got her when she was actually really big, and she has refused to do anything but live for me. I cannot get her on the frozen thawed. But if you can see here, let me get her up here. There's kind of an injury right here from a rat. If you can see it right where my thumb is. If you can see right on the tip of her nose, she actually got bit by a rat as she was trying to eat it. And that's something that you're unfortunately not going to get away with. You can try to stun the rat before you feed it. But the other thing I like to do is I get my feeding tongs here, and as soon as I throw that rat in there and I know she's gonna eat it, I watch. As soon as she wraps it up, I figure out where the rat's teeth are, and I try to make sure that I can grab the rat's teeth with these feeding tongs and try to just make sure that they're not sinking into the snake anywhere, because typically, they wrap them up, and most of the bites that I've seen happen like up on the upper third of the snake. So if you can keep, a set of feeding tongs kind of just idly by, just in case when you're feeding these bigger rats, then it will kind of help prevent injuries to these snakes. Now, she has taken a couple bites. I think the other blue-eye Lucy I have down here, Crystal, has taken a couple bites, but they haven't been anything that, if you're keeping the environment clean, I haven't had any issues with infections with the snakes. Most of my other snakes, because they're not that size, I usually try to feed them small rats instead of mediums, so that I'm not running into the issue with injuries. Any of the other adult females that I have that are around 2,000 grams, if I feed them a small rat, it's a smaller meal, but they eat them more consistently on a regular basis, and the injury factor goes completely down. I've never actually had a rat bite from one of the smaller rats being fed to an adult female. So, you're gonna have to feed live. Watching the comments on one of my posts from a couple weeks back, there's a lot of misinformation in there, and somebody was actually telling people to force feed your snakes frozen thawed rats, and I do not force feed anything. The only thing that I've ever had to force feed were like 2 or 3 hatchlings, and that was out of 150 hatchlings that I've produced so far. I've had to force feed, and those snakes probably would have died if we didn't do that, because they weren't eating anything. I gave them about a month to start feeding. They didn't do it. And then one of them probably had to be force fed for about 6 months before it actually started eating on its own. And the other one was maybe a month or 2 when it started feeding on its own. And they now feed on their own on a regular basis, and they're happy and healthy. So you do not force feed your snakes unless it's like a dire situation where it's a hatchling and it's going to die if it doesn't start eating very soon. These adults, there's a lot of experimentation needs to go on. I have a lot of adults that have switched over to mice only, which stinks because mice are so itty bitty. And these are, that's an adult mouse right there. And as you can see, in my hand, that's not very big. That's not going to fill up your snake. So you're going to have to feed your adult ball python a ton of those to get them full. So ball pythons, experimentation with feeding is really going to be the big thing you're going to have to do. If you can't get a snake that's already feeding on frozen thawed, you're probably going to be stuck feeding it live. So make sure that you have a source of live rodents you can get for it. If you need to produce them yourself, it's very easy. You buy a male and a female and you let them go. And you can produce them very fast that way, even if you just buy a pair of rats. So please don't force feed your adult snakes. It is safe to feed your snakes live rats. It's a little tricky if you're trying to feed an adult female a bigger rat. Just be cautious, pay attention, make sure those rats' teeth aren't sinking into your snake, and everybody's going to be happy and healthy. So thank you guys for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.